there are some stories that just refuse to be adapted properly. And Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is probably the most infamous example. Published in 1865, it tells the story of a girl who falls into a nonsensical world that thrives in its own madness, one that filmmakers have been trying, and often struggling, to translate to the screen for well over a century. We're talking as far back as 1903. And the problem is pretty obvious. There's no traditional structure, no clear narrative progression, no real sense of cause and effect. It's just like a dream, a weird, surreal, constantly shifting dream. And yet, despite all of that, Disney somehow pulled it off. In 1951, Disney released its own version of Alice in Wonderland. And I think it's the best one, although not the most accurate. Because what I personally feel makes a great adaptation of this story isn't how closely it follows the source material. It's how well it captures the feeling of it, what it's actually like to experience Wonderland. The story follows Alice, a young girl who finds herself bored with the structured, logical world around her. After spotting a peculiar white rabbit, she follows him down a rabbit hole and ends up in Wonderland, a bizarre, unpredictable world filled with strange characters, nonsense logic, and constantly shifting rules. Throughout her journey, Alice encounters a series of increasingly absurd situations, from nonsensical tea parties to an encounter with the ruthless Queen of Hearts. This wasn't just a random small project for Walt Disney. He had been fascinated with Alice's Adventures in Wonderland since the 1920s. Some of his earliest work, like Alice's Wonderland from 1923, even experimented with a live-action girl in an animated world, which was something he briefly considered for a feature version as well. He planned to adapt the story as early as the 1930s, around the time of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but the project kept getting delayed, partly due to World War II, and partly because the story itself is just incredibly difficult to structure. The script went through multiple writers over the years, with different versions ranging from faithful adaptations to more comedic takes. And that long development process is a big reason why the final film feels so episodic. Production finally began in the late 1940s with directors Clyde Geronimi, Wilfred Jackson, and Hamilton Luske. When the film premiered in 1951, it wasn't a success. Critics found it too chaotic and lacking emotional depth. And believe it or not, even Walt Disney himself felt it was missing heart. But over time, that perception changed. Through multiple re-releases, especially in the 60s and 70s, audiences began to embrace the very things that were once criticized: its surreal tone, its randomness, its dreamlike logic, and today, it stands as one of Disney's most unique films. That whole unusual development process shaped almost every part of the final movie. The structure and themes are where Disney's version really stands out, because most adaptations of Alice fall into one of two traps. They either follow the book too closely, especially with the dialogue, resulting in something that feels disjointed, unfocused, and too literary, or they change so much that it doesn't even feel like Wonderland anymore. Yeah, not a fan. But the 1951 film finds a balance. It embraces the surreal, nonsensical nature of the original story, but it frames it within a loose three-act structure that gives the film momentum and flow, as well as tightening the dialogue to sound more natural. Even though it feels like Alice going from one strange character to the next, the movie still has a clear setup, rising action, and resolution. More importantly, it actually gives Alice something the book barely provides: a goal. At the start, Alice wants a world that doesn't follow rules, a world driven by imagination instead of logic, instead of just following curiosity alone. And Wonderland seems like exactly that, but as the film progresses, that dream starts to fall apart. The nonsense becomes frustrating, the unpredictability becomes stressful, and the lack of logic becomes genuinely scary. What starts as wish fulfillment turns into a cautionary tale: be careful what you wish for. And through Alice's perspective, the story starts to feel almost like a child's interpretation of the adult world, confusing, inconsistent, and often unfair. And that's why this version works. It doesn't force Wonderland into a traditional story, but it doesn't let it drift either. It finds a balance, where the world stays chaotic, but Alice's journey gives it meaning. That's the genius of this movie. It doesn't just adapt the story, it adapts the experience of reading it. If you enjoy deep dives into overlooked animated movies, feel free to like and subscribe. Don't forget to also let me know in the comments what animated film you'd like me to cover next. One of the biggest challenges Disney faced at the time was animating human characters. Even after the success of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, they struggled to find the right balance. Films like Pinocchio and The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad leaned more into stylized, cartoony human designs, but by the time they made Cinderella, they had refined a more naturalistic approach thanks to them using live-action reference footage. They would film actors on a soundstage whilst animators studied their movements. Think of it as the predecessor of modern-day motion capture. And Alice builds on that. She feels believable, but still stylized enough to exist in this strange world. And that contrast is important, because whilst Alice looks grounded and real, the rest of Wonderland doesn't. The highlight in regards to the animation that always stuck in my mind is the marching cards scene. It makes my head spin just imagining the amount of time and effort it took to pull off this sequence back in the 1950s, using solely hand-drawn animation. It really is a sight to behold. I'll admit, I do miss when Disney used to do trippy scenes like this and the pink elephants from Dumbo. And then there's the visual design. The film's look is heavily influenced by Mary Blair, one of the most influential yet underappreciated artists in animation history. I mentioned her in my Sleeping Beauty video, but here, her style dominates the film with her use of bold colours, abstract shapes, and simplified backgrounds that give Wonderland a completely unique identity. A lot of the time, the backgrounds feel minimal, even black, but this only adds to the dreamlike, almost disorientating quality of the film whilst keeping the focus on our characters. And that's what makes the animation so effective. It's not just technically impressive, it's intentional. Alice feels grounded, the world around her doesn't, and that contrast pulls you deeper into the madness. With the help of Mary Blair's bold, surreal designs, the film doesn't just look like Wonderland, it feels like it. Now for our characters. Who can forget such iconic characters from the original story, from the Mad Hatter to the Cheshire Cat? Well, the film certainly does them justice in my opinion. Our protagonist, Alice, is the only character who really changes, and that's exactly why she works. Like her book counterpart, as well as characters such as Dorothy Gale or Bilbo Baggins, she's the quintessential normal person thrown into an abnormal world. Despite serving like a mouthpiece for the audience where they ask the same questions that she does like a typical blank slate character from a novel, I find her surprisingly not boring. A lot of her charm and personality comes from her actress, Catherine Beaumont. She not only voiced her, but she was also on set where the artist used her as reference. Hell, she pretty much already is Alice before the camera started rolling. She gives Alice a sense of childlike curiosity, frustration, and emotional vulnerability that carries the entire film. She would later portray Wendy in Peter Pan, and voice Alice again in the first Kingdom Hearts game. But unlike the book, the film makes her slightly older and gives her a clear motivation. She wants to escape her boring structured life and live in a world driven by imagination. And that's incredibly relatable, especially for kids. And the film doesn't stop there, it lets her grow. As Wonderland becomes more chaotic and overwhelming, Alice begins to realize that maybe structure and logic aren't such bad things after all. And that realization all comes to a head at the end of the second act. I mentioned in my Sleeping Beauty video that the death of Aurora was one of the saddest scenes in Disney history, and I still stand by that. But it's not the scene that makes me teary-eyed. For whatever reason, it's this one. It's where she gets lost in the woods and sings a melancholic song fittingly called Very Good Advice. Firstly, I think it's because anytime a child is in distress, it's always upsetting. Second, Catherine's performance is fantastic, especially as a child actress, because she is practically sobbing her eyes out in the latter half of the song. I also think it's the simple fact that after getting completely lost following all the madness she's endured, she just gives up. She's overwhelmed and emotionally exhausted. It's so depressing to watch. That combination of vulnerability, performance, and context makes the scene hit incredibly hard. Meanwhile, most of the side characters are completely unhinged, in the best way possible. From the eccentric Mad Hatter to the volatile Queen of Hearts, many of them are mad on so many different levels. There are some exceptions, such as the Doorknob and the Caterpillar, who do offer some help and advice to Alice along the way.
A mushroom, of course!
I never said they were all pleasant. Part of the reason that I love the characters is that most will do mad things for mad reasons. Why are the Mad Hatter, March Hare, and Dormouse constantly celebrating? Because there's one birthday and 364 unbirthdays in a year. Not really accurate to the book, but it does work within the film's context. Why do the Queen's guards paint the roses red? Because they accidentally planted white ones. It's completely irrational, but strangely makes sense in their world, in a way that only a child could come up with, just like in the book. The other thing that makes the characters so interesting is that you don't know what to expect. They have such sudden mood swings that you're never quite sure what's going to happen next. They can go from friendly, fearful, to even menacing in some cases. The Cheshire Cat, for instance, acts differently in every encounter. The first time, he acts a little crazy. The second time, he helps Alice out of a predicament. And finally, he gets Alice into a lot of trouble just for his own amusement. The Queen of Hearts, as you can expect, has the biggest mood swings, going from polite to homicidal within seconds. She's easily one of the most entertaining characters in the movie, as well as one of Disney's more underrated antagonists. All of this keeps the film constantly engaging. It would be such a disservice to forget to mention all the very talented actors that portray them and help make them so distinct. The most notable ones include Ed Wynn, Sterling Holloway, Jerry Colonna, Richard Hayden, Verna Felton, and Bill Thompson. Some of them were already Disney regulars. All of that is what makes the characters so memorable. Alice gives the story its emotional core, but everyone else brings the chaos. They're unpredictable, irrational, and completely mad, yet somehow still make perfect sense within their world. And that balance is what makes Wonderland feel so alive. One thing I find funny is that I've hardly ever heard of this film getting labelled as a musical, even though it technically is. I'm sure there are people out there that do, but I've personally never met them myself. The score was composed by Oliver Wallace, with songs written by a team of songwriters including Sammy Fain, Bob Hilliard, Mac David, Al Hoffman, and Jerry Livingston. Aside from the respected voice actors, the vocals were sung by the Judd Conlon Chorus. They give this movie such an ethereal, dreamlike quality, yet it's still done so beautifully. I really miss when Disney would have these opening titles with that kind of music. Just listening to the opening theme with those fantastic drawings that take inspiration from the book illustrations really makes me feel like a child again. But what makes the soundtrack interesting is how it's used. Most musicals use songs to advance the plot or express a character's emotions. Alice in Wonderland doesn't really do that. Most of the songs are just expressions of the world itself. Most of them are playful, strange, and often completely disconnected from any real narrative purpose, which fits perfectly because Wonderland itself doesn't follow narrative rules. Some songs, like The Walrus and the Carpenter, directly use lyrics straight from the source material, whilst others, like All in the Golden Afternoon, are mostly inspired by actual poems written by Lewis Carroll. They all have great lyrics and some very clever wordplay that feels like it was taken straight from the original text. The only exceptions are the two sung by Alice herself. In a World of My Own establishes her motive, a desire to escape her boring, mundane world into something more imaginative. And Very Good Advice, aka the saddest goddamn Disney song I've ever heard, serves as her emotional breaking point where she self-reflects and acknowledges how her curiosity has led her astray and how she longs to be back to her ordinary life. And that contrast is what makes the song numbers work. Amid all the nonsense, Alice is the one thing that feels real. They don't drive the story, they are a part of the world, strange, playful, and completely unconcerned with logic, until Alice steps in. Because whilst Wonderland sings in nonsense, Alice sings with meaning. Now to be fair, this film isn't perfect. Some of the criticism it received, especially early on, is understandable. It is episodic, it is chaotic, and it doesn't follow a traditional narrative structure akin to a lot of Disney's previous works. But those aren't necessarily failures. If anything, they're a part of what makes it such a faithful interpretation of the original story's tone. That said, I do have a couple of personal nitpicks. There's so much material from the books that didn't make it into the film, like the Griffin, the Mock Turtle, the Jabberwocky, the White Knight. It would have been so interesting to see how they would have been adapted into animation. And honestly, I'm kind of surprised Disney never made a direct-to-video sequel, especially considering how many of their films got one in the late 90s and early 2000s during that crazy trend. Lewis Carroll literally wrote a sequel book, Through the Looking Glass. It seemed like such an ideal opportunity without feeling too forced. But ultimately, those flaws don't take away from the film. If anything, they help define it. Because what might feel messy or incomplete in another story feels exactly right for Wonderland. So, 75 years later, why does Disney's Alice in Wonderland still stand above other adaptations in my opinion? Because it understands something that so many other film versions don't. Wonderland isn't supposed to make perfect sense. It's not supposed to follow clean structure or logic. It's supposed to feel strange, unpredictable, and just a little overwhelming, and told through the imaginative eyes of a child. Instead of trying to fix that, this film embraces it. Through its structure, its animation, its characters, and even its music, it captures the spirit of Alice's adventures in Wonderland in a way that feels natural to film without losing what makes the original so special. It's not the most accurate version, but I personally think it's the one that gets it right. Because at the end of the day, the best adaptation of this story isn't the one that copies every detail, it's the one that makes you feel like you've truly fallen down the rabbit hole. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.